In the quiet heart of North Warwickshire, where narrow lanes wind through farmland, stands a place you may not have heard of. It's not as well known as nearby Warwick or Kenilworth castles. It isn't as famous as Borley Rectory or 50 Berkeley Square. And unlike sites such as Pendle Hill or the ancient Ram Inn, you can't book ghost tours or overnight vigils here. It's an unassuming place at first glance. Trees press in close. The landscape feels soft, pretty, even peaceful. And then, as you walk toward the church of St Mary the Virgin, there rise the broken, imposing walls of Astley Castle. This is a place shaped by ambition, betrayal, and loss. It has been a home, a sanctuary, a restaurant, and a ruin. It is bound up with the lives of queens and would-be queens, with rebellion and execution, and with stories that refuse to stay buried. And like so many places where history took a cruel turn, it has long been said that the past still lingers here. Not because it seeks attention, but because history here was unfinished. Join me as I explore the haunted history of Astley, its church, its castle, and the echoes that remain. Sited on the boundary of Nuneaton, the hometown of novelist George Eliot, Astley is not a castle in the grand sense. Rather, it's a fortified manor, though that distinction matters little when you're standing before its moat and curtain walls. The site has been occupied since Saxon times. By the early 12th century, it belonged to Philip de Eslega, from whom the village takes its name. Over the centuries it grew, changed hands, and gathered layers of meaning. In the 13th century, it was crenellated and moated. In the 14th, a chantry, later a college of priests, was founded beside it, tying the fate of the manor closely to the church that still stands here today. By the early 15th century, Astley had passed through marriage into the hands of the Grey family. And it was through the Greys that this quiet Warwickshire manor became entangled with the English crown. Astley Castle has associations with 3 Queens of England, though only one ever wore the crown in her own right, and then only briefly. The first was Elizabeth Woodville, who married Sir John Grey of Groby around 1452. This was the age of the Wars of the Roses, and despite Astley's proximity to the Yorkist Earl of Warwick's stronghold, Sir John remained a Lancastrian, loyal to King Henry VI. He fought for Margaret of Anjou at the Second Battle of St Albans on the 17th of February 1461, in which he died, leaving Elizabeth a widow with 2 young sons. Elizabeth lived for a time in reduced circumstances at Astley. It was here, in this quiet retreat, that her fortunes were at their lowest. They changed dramatically, though, when she caught the attention of Edward IV. Their secret marriage made her Queen of England, and she would become the mother of the infamous princes in the Tower. Her daughter, also called Elizabeth, would go on to marry Henry VII, making her the second Queen of England to be connected to Astley Castle. These 2 Elizabeths, despite tragedies and turbulent lives, seem to rest easy. Their ghosts, it is said, do not linger here. But the castle is forever bound to another queen, one far younger, far gentler, and far less willing. The great-great-granddaughter of Elizabeth Woodville, Lady Jane Grey. Jane's father was Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk. Her mother was Frances Brandon, a niece of Henry VIII. Henry Grey had inherited Astley Castle from his own father, Thomas Grey, who died in 1530. Some accounts, including those written by Meg Elizabeth Atkins and Betty Smith, suggest that Jane spent part of her childhood at Astley, and that these were among the happiest years of her short life. Other sources are more cautious, suggesting that Jane was only an infrequent visitor, spending more time at Bradgate Park in Leicestershire and Astley Castle in Gloucestershire. What is certain is that Jane was intelligent, deeply pious, and happiest in the company of her books. She spoke Latin and Greek, studied Hebrew and Italian, and was considered a very learned young woman. Unfortunately, Jane's father was ambitious, vain, and easily led. Through a web of dynastic claims and political manoeuvring, largely at the urging of the powerful Duke of Northumberland, Jane was placed on the throne after the death of the young King Edward VI in July 1553. She was just 17 years old. Her reign lasted 9 days. Mary Tudor marched into London with popular support, and Jane was deposed. She and her husband, Guildford Dudley, who was the Duke of Northumberland's son, were imprisoned in the Tower of London, and, on the 12th of February 1554, both were beheaded for treason. Jane died as she had lived, quietly, devoutly, and with dignity. And her ghost appears in several places associated with her life and death. At Bradgate Park, she is said to ride in a spectral coach, sometimes seen travelling to church on Christmas Eve with her severed head resting in her lap. She's often seen at the Tower of London, sometimes near her grave at the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, at other times in the Salt Tower or the White Tower. Occasional reports link her spirit to Astley Castle, where she spent part of her youth. And here at Astley, she appears to move lightly through the building, a pale, sorrowful figure, sometimes dressed in red, sometimes in grey. Witnesses describe her not as frightening, but as melancholy, a presence that feels more like memory than menace. In 2021, a modern sighting briefly reignited interest in her story. Paul Sanders, a history enthusiast filming at Astley Castle, captured footage of what appeared to be a dark-haired woman in period dress standing silently by a doorway before vanishing from view. He later said he was convinced no one could have been there because the site was closed and gated. He believes the figure may have been Lady Jane Grey. Unlike Anne Boleyn, whose headless spectre is said to wander endlessly across England, Jane appears only rarely. But when she does, it is always in places closely tied to her childhood, her imprisonment, or her death. Jane is often described as a sacrificial pawn in a political chess game played by powerful men. She was certainly betrayed by her father, who proclaimed Mary queen and left his daughter to her fate. A young life sacrificed to ambitions that were not her own. It is perhaps no wonder that Jane's memory should haunt us still. Unlike the Duke of Northumberland, who was swiftly executed for treason, Jane's father was at first released from the Tower of London. But his involvement in Sir Thomas Wyatt's rebellion against Queen Mary soon sealed his fate. He fled back to Astley, hoping to hide on familiar ground. According to local tradition, he took refuge in a huge, hollow oak tree. William Dugdale records the story in his Antiquities of Warwickshire, published in 1656. Seeing he was forsaken, he put himself under the trust of one Underwood, as 'tis said, a keeper of his park here at Astley, who hid him some few days in a large hollow tree there, standing about 2 bow shoots southwestwards from the church, but being promised a reward, betrayed him, so that it was not long ere he lost his head on Tower Hill. Yes, offered a bribe, Underwood betrayed his master. Henry Grey was dragged from the tree, taken to London, and beheaded on Tower Hill in February 1554, just 2 weeks after the execution of his young daughter. The oak tree itself survived for centuries before finally falling in a gale in 1891. Today, a memorial stone marks the spot where it once stood. And it is said that Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, still walks this path. Witnesses have described a silent, headless figure gliding between the castle and the place where the oak once stood, before vanishing, forever doomed to repeat the final journey of his brief freedom. There is an eerie postscript to this story, the matter of the Duke of Suffolk's head. In the mid-19th century, workers discovered a mummified human head was in the vault beneath the Church of Holy Trinity, Minories in London. The oak sawdust surrounding the head appeared to have preserved the skin and facial features. The vicar, Samuel Kins, wrote in a letter to a newspaper in 1893 that the head may be the Duke of Suffolk. Walter George Bell later described seeing the relic, noting the marks on the neck where the executioner's blade had struck, the first blow failing, the second true. Bell claimed that a medical examination at the time by a local government board inspector supported the head's Tudor origin. When Holy Trinity was closed, the head, now sealed in an airtight glassed case, found its way to St Botolph's Church in Aldgate, but doubts about its identity have always persisted. Later writers pointed to a scandal at Holy Trinity in the 18th century when coffins were broken open and bodies dismembered by what one account described as an unscrupulous beadle. Others questioned whether sawdust could really preserve human remains so effectively. In his 2008 book London Law, Steve Roud dryly notes the improbability of rats and decay leaving such a relic untouched. In 1990, during archaeological work at St Botolph's, the head was recovered from a sealed vault and finally reinterred in the churchyard. If this mummified relic truly was Henry Grey's head, then it was laid to rest centuries after his body, a body likely buried without ceremony near the place of execution. Perhaps a fittingly unsettled end for a man whose ambition cost so much. During the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Astley formed part of the world that shaped one of England's greatest novelists. The agent for the nearby Arbury estate at this time was Robert Evans. In 1804, he moved to Astley with his first wife, Harriet, to serve his employer, Francis Newdigate. Harriet Evans died young in 1809, and in 1813, Robert remarried. In 1819, his daughter, Mary Ann Evans, was born. She would become known to the world as George Eliot. Much of Eliot's early work draws deeply on the rural Warwickshire landscape and the people who inhabited it. The quiet lanes, the parish church, the rhythms of village life were all transformed into fiction. Here at Astley, both the castle and the church found new life in her writing, reimagined as Nebley Abbey and Nebley Church in scenes of clerical life. In this way, Astley Castle and St Mary's are not only places of haunting and history, but part of the literary fabric of England. Their stones carry not just memories of queens and rebels, but of stories that helped shape how rural England would be remembered. And of course, not all of Astley's ghosts are noble or royal. Local tradition speaks of a cowled monk seen near the Church of St Mary the Virgin and the surrounding castle grounds. He makes no sound. There are no footsteps, no whispered prayers, just the quiet presence of a solitary figure moving slowly along paths that once led between prayer and shelter. One former estate worker became so accustomed to the monk's appearances that he gave him a name, Willie. He would see the figure walking the grounds or sitting quietly on a stile as though waiting, and yet, whenever he drew too close, Willie would simply vanish, dissolving back into shadow as though he'd never been there at all. It's a small, almost intimate haunting, less like a tale shaped for thrill-seekers and more like a fragment of the past that refuses to fully fade, a reminder that the church and castle were once places of devotion as well as power, and that not all who passed through them are remembered by name. During the Second World War, Astley Castle entered another, very different chapter. It was used as a reception centre where soldiers and members of the voluntary aid detachments could recuperate before returning to their units. And being so close to Coventry, the skies above the castle were often filled with German bombers. Locals recall that on moonlit nights, the light reflecting off Astley Pool became a navigation aid to guide raids towards the city. Even now, locals report the sound of ghostly aircraft passing overhead, the deep, unmistakable throb of piston engines, as if the past still circles above Astley, unable or unwilling to move on. The strain of wartime took its toll. The castle fell into serious disrepair and, in the post-war period, was eventually let for £1 a week to Mr. and Mrs. Tunnicliffe, who obtained permission to convert it into a hotel. For the next 25 years, it operated as a restaurant, bar and tea rooms until, in 1978, just days after the lease expired, Astley Castle was ravaged by a mysterious fire. Newspapers reported that police had discovered creepy rag dolls pierced with nails and a papier-mâché bird with its throat slit and chest smeared with red paint. In the era of satanic panic, of course, black magic was immediately suspected, especially as the room which contained the dolls had a magic circle made of beer mats on the floor. But calmer voices pointed out that the objects found after the fire were almost certainly decorations left behind after a Halloween party. Neville Challoner, who had run the hotel on the site immediately before the fire, dismissed the idea of hauntings altogether, stating plainly, "No, I never saw any ghosts." And yet, by then, rumours had taken hold. As with Highgate Cemetery and St Mary's Clophill, fear and folklore began to feed on one another. Sensational reporting attracted vandals. Vandals caused damage, and each new scar deepened the sense that something was wrong here, until Astley Castle slipped into ruin. Today, the castle has found new life. After decades of neglect, damage and decay, it was rescued by the Landmark Trust. Rather than attempting to recreate some imagined former glory, they chose to accept the ruin as part of the story. Modern accommodation now sits within the ancient walls, carefully and respectfully woven into what remains. It's a place people can stay, live in, walk through, and that feels right because Astley Castle has never been just a monument to the past. It has always been occupied by the living and, if the stories are to be believed, by the dead. Lady Jane Grey, flitting through the ruins of her childhood home. Her father, condemned to walk without his head between castle and oak. A monk, lingering in the shadows by the church. A castle that has burned, crumbled, and endured. You don't have to believe in ghosts to feel that Astley is a place where history presses close, where memory clings to stone, where injustice, ambition, and sorrow have left their mark. And if you stand here long enough, listening to the wind moving through broken walls or the quiet around the church, you may begin to sense that the past is not silent at all. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of Warwickshire's hidden realms. If you enjoy exploring places where history and folklore intertwine, then please like and hype the video and subscribe to the channel. It really does help keep journeys like this possible. And until next time, take care and keep searching for hidden realms.